That's all right. Just want to make sure you can see my screen. Is that okay?
Perfect, thank you.
Brilliant. So I'm going to cover 4 separate topics to try and give you an overview in as much detail as I can, while also finishing with some practical tips. So I just want to start clarifying why we care about glucose control, because I think there is some general misunderstanding I see about that. I'm going to move on the bulk of my talk to looking at the evidence for plant-based diets on prevention and management of type 2 diabetes, consider the mechanisms of action afterwards, and then tie it all up with some practical advice and tips at the end. So, why do we care about elevated glucose? The reason I've got this slide on is because CGMs are big news now. People are using CGMs in people without pre-diabetes or type 2 diabetes. So I want to clarify this, that the reason we care about elevated glucose, 2 reasons. Firstly, in pre-diabetes or in pre-diabetes, it's a symptom of underlying pathophysiology. So something's going wrong underneath. And all of that pathophysiology is associated with cardiovascular risk and other diseases. Glucose is only a cause, so far as we know, of damage independently once we get to the levels that you see in diabetes. So far as we know, glucose is directly damaging in diabetes, but it is an indicator things are going wrong in pre-diabetes. And this matters for how we deal with it, because that means to prevent type 2 diabetes, you basically should be focusing on fixing the underlying pathophysiology. Now, in diabetes or in type 2 diabetes as well, yes, that's a good idea too, where possible. But lowering glucose per se also becomes an urgent priority. So there's some similarities and differences between those 2 things. So let's look at that then. Prevention and management of type 2 diabetes. What is the evidence? So let's start with prevention. People watching may be aware of the big type 2 diabetes prevention trials. They've been done over the past couple of decades in every society, in every country, and there's evidence for it in all populations so far as we know. And in general, they're focusing on weight loss, but there are a couple of things that we can tease out. So I've highlighted in yellow the 2 studies that included specifically high fiber, which of course is coming from our plant-based foods. And it seems to be a bit beneficial. We talk more particularly about that, but I want to highlight the Indian diabetes prevention study, because in that study, people did not actually lose weight, but they did get prevention of type 2 diabetes by this lifestyle, which was, as you can see, avoiding simple sugars and refined carbs, keeping fat very, very low, physical activity up, and increasing fiber. So I'll go closer into the evidence, but I do want to highlight how powerful lifestyle is for prevention of type 2 diabetes. And this was the key study that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2002. And it was the first study that I know of, or I think at the time, to compare lifestyle to metformin. And that is so important because metformin is a known, we think, insulin sensitizer. And so the fact that a multi-component lifestyle intervention was able to prevent type 2 diabetes was huge. But the really key thing to understand in terms of everything we know about type 2 diabetes, weight loss and weight gain is the biggest story we have. And so this is looking at the degree of weight loss, that's on the x-axis, and your risk of type 2 diabetes, that's on the y-axis. And what you can see that if you lose about 5 kilograms of weight, a person's risk of incident rate per 100 years goes to about 5. But if someone is losing all the way to 15 kilograms, their risk of type 2 diabetes is basically close to 0. So we cannot deny that weight loss is has the greatest impact on prevention of type 2 diabetes. And that probably is still true even for people at lower BMIs, because it's probably removing visceral fat and ectopic fat. Likewise, thinking about in type 2 diabetes, this is from the DIRECT trial, which was a study looking at remission of type 2 diabetes. You can see on the x-axis, we have weight loss. So you can see that if people lost 15 kilograms of weight, look at the y-axis, that's the proportion of people who got remission, is 86%. So if you can lose and maintain 15 kilograms of weight loss, your chance of having non-diabetic glucose is 86% of people at 1 year. It goes down as people lose less weight. And if we look at what happens if you lose 7 kilograms, sorry, less than 5 kilograms, 7% of those people got remission of type 2 diabetes. So unquestionably, prevention and remission are both driven largely by weight loss. But the key question is, how do we get weight loss? And in terms of plant-based diets, it's worth mentioning that we don't talk enough about energy density. So that's the calories per gram of food. And this is a post-hoc analysis done in one of the big diabetes prevention studies, the Finnish diabetes prevention study. And you can see if you had a high-fat, low-fiber diet, you got the lowest amount of weight loss. If it was high-fat and high-fiber, or low-fat and low-fiber, it didn't seem to make too much of a difference. But the best outcome was low-fat and high-fiber. And so this is typically a pretty plant-based diet. So if you're having a reduced amount of fat, commonly from animal-based foods and so forth, and high fiber, it looks like that's getting you the best weight change. And I think that's probably driven by energy density, the fact that it has the lowest number of calories per gram. And I think these graphs are so important because of the narrative we have around ultra-processed foods. The ultra-processed foods are causing, as a category, causing us to gain weight. And you might know about a very famous study by Kevin Hall, who's a researcher, who showed that a diet really predominantly ultra-processed caused weight gain. And it was about 500 calories a day extra people were having on the ultra-processed diet versus the unprocessed diet. But if you look at that paper, the ultra-processed diet had higher energy density. And we have known for decades that if you have a high energy dense diet, you're more likely to gain weight. If you have a low energy dense diet, you're likely to lose weight. And so you can see on the left-hand side, this meta-analysis, it looks like the mean reduction between high and low energy dense diets is about 500 kilocalories. On the right-hand side, this is a study done in schools, and you can see if you have a high energy dense diet, people are more likely to eat more. And again, it's kind of surprising to me that it looks like this is about 500 calories a day. So I think the story here is a processed diet, highly processed diet, or a high fat energy dense diet, in many cases looks like it's likely to cause weight gain. Similarly, if we look at weight loss studies where they were intentionally trying to help people lose weight, the lower energy density of the diet, the more weight people lose. So this is a really consistent story. And the great thing about adding plants to a diet, not even having an entirely plant-based diet, but filling up a plate of food with vegetables and having fruit and so forth, you are going to have a lower energy dense diet. And that leads to spontaneously lower energy intake. So can plant-based diets, we talked about weight loss, can plant-based diets help prevent or manage type 2 diabetes independent of weight loss? I've talked about weight loss. Everyone knows that, and I think plant-based diets can help people lose weight. But is there something about plant-based foods or plant-based diets that can help lower glucose, prevent and manage type 2, even if you don't lose weight? And I think there is evidence for this, but I think the magnitude of effect is probably pretty small. So you might know of the PREDIMED study. This was a big study. The primary outcome was on cardiovascular disease, and it was done in Spain. They had 3 groups. 2 of the groups were basically a Mediterranean diet. One was supplemented with, I think it was about 25 grams of nuts a day, and one was supplemented with 1 liter of extra virgin olive oil a week. The control group was supposed to be a low-fat diet. But because it was done in Spain, what actually happened is that the control group had a kind of light Mediterranean diet. They actually had a ton of olive oil, but it wasn't necessarily extra virgin olive oil. But what was great about this study is that people didn't tend to lose weight in it. So all of the results that they got, whether on cardiovascular disease or on type 2 diabetes, are independent of weight. And it did look like there was a signal for risk reduction of type 2 diabetes in the PREDIMED study. So it looks like there's some benefit, but we have to be honest and say that the 95% confidence intervals are quite wide. And what that means, we aren't completely certain about the result. And it also looked like it only reached significance when they combined both groups, so the extra virgin olive oil and the nut group, to power it against the control group. So I think that there is some signal here that the nuts and extra virgin olive oil seem to do something, but it wasn't a massive effect. But then let me clarify, this was not comparing extra virgin olive oil and nuts in a Mediterranean-based diet to a bad diet. It was actually comparing extra virgin olive oil and nuts to actually a pretty good diet. So the fact that we still got a signal there, I think is quite telling. And this is really exciting nutritionally because, well, what's the difference between extra virgin olive oil and olive oil? Like, there's no meaningful difference in any of the fatty acids. What it comes down to is the polyphenols. So there is something about these phytonutrients, these compounds, that somehow seem to be having these small but quite powerful effects. Likewise with the nuts, there's there's fiber in nuts, there's phytonutrients, but it didn't meaningfully change the fat component of the diet. And I think that's really important because we do talk a lot about fat, and I'm going to show you some evidence for unsaturated versus saturated, but it does tell us there is something about these ingredients, these small phytonutrients, that seem to have benefits. And this is really important because we basically get these from plants. There's a study not many people have heard of, but I think it's pretty important. It's called the OptiFit study, and this was looking at type 2 diabetes prevention. So it basically tested your normal type 2 diabetes prevention program. So, you know, healthy eating, low fat, do more exercise and try and lose a bit of weight. One group was supplemented with insoluble fiber, and one group wasn't. They got a placebo supplement. Now, they looked at the results 1 year and 2 years. And they didn't see any change in fasting glucose significantly. It looked like there was a signal, but it wasn't significant. Likewise with hemoglobin A1C, there was no difference in the area under the curve. So that's the total glucose exposure you get after a meal, or in HOMA-IR, and that's a measure of insulin resistance. So no difference in any of those, but there was a significant reduction in 2-hour plasma glucose. So is something going on here? Is fiber, and again, that's coming from plant foods, doing something? Probably. But again, I don't think the difference is, or the magnitude of effect is that big when we put it into the context of overall weight loss. So it's a good thing, but I think we need to be honest about the magnitude of effect of these things. So that's prevention. I think that it definitely, plants and fiber is playing a role, but it's not nearly as big as the role of weight and physical activity. Then we come to some really good studies, and I wanted to go into these in more depth and tell you about the method because there's, in the plant-based world, I see these cited a lot and they're quite exciting, but I don't think they're telling us what people think they are. So I want to look carefully at these and see what we think we can tell from them. So these were really old school studies. I mean, these were done in the late 70s, 80s, and they were looking at really high carb, high fiber diets in different kinds of diabetes. So these were really well done. Some of them were ward-based, so they actually brought people on, they monitored them really carefully. And in this particular study, the one I just put on that page, is that it was all of the participants received controlled diets for 7 days. That's great because you start everyone in the study evenly. They then had a 70% carbohydrate diet. So 70% of the calories came from carbohydrate, and it was high fiber. So they got 65 grams a day of fiber, and they followed that diet for an average of 16 days. The diets were specifically designed to be weight maintaining, and they might have lost like 2 or 3 pounds, but it wasn't very much. Now, these individuals were on insulin. And this is quite important because I don't think this is way back before we've had updated diabetes guidelines, and possibly they might be type 2, but they might not. And I'll talk more about that. But they were on insulin. And the insulin dose was reduced massively. So that on average, they came down from 26 to 11 units of insulin a day. And there were big differences. So if people didn't need much insulin to begin with, they were far more likely to be able to come off all of their insulin. So on the high carbohydrate, high fiber diet, they were able to discontinue all insulin in the majority of the patients who were only receiving 15 to 20 units a day. But you'll see on on the next slides, and as I talk about this, the more units of insulin people were on, the less likely they were to come off. So this, though, looks pretty exciting. And if you were at a conference and someone presented this, you'd be like, oh my God, they didn't lose weight. They look at how many units of insulin they were on. And so the study was progressing, and as the study progressed, they were able to remove more and more insulin, so they could withdraw more of the insulin. But the reason I'm highlighting this is because I've heard people kind of say, oh, you don't need to lose weight. Plant-based diets can get people into remission. I don't think they can, because if you look at the data within this study, only 3 people achieved a fasting glucose below 7. So the majority had a fasting glucose 7-8 millimoles per litre. Like I said, most had above 8.3, and the effect on postprandial was really inconsistent. Some people had no reduction, and some people still looked like very, very diabetic, if I can say that. Now, I mentioned at the start when I introduced this, I'm not entirely sure everyone in this cohort had type 2 diabetes. Possibly some had monogenic, maybe some were atypical type 1. And it's also worth mentioning, though, to be fair to these investigators, when they did this study, type 2 diabetes or diabetes was diagnosed with a fasting glucose of 7.8. So they probably were withdrawing the insulin because some of the people got below 7.8, but they got nowhere close to 7. So I think we need to be cautious, and bearing in mind this was, did I say 63 grams of a fiber, super high fiber, and it's still not, without weight loss, getting us to safe levels of glucose, despite the very impressive withdrawal of insulin. So there are some more old school studies. This one was 18 lean people. They had non-insulin dependent diabetes. The duration of type 2 diabetes was 4.5 years, and it was a crossover study, so they followed each diet for 6 weeks. And let's take a close look at these diets. So that it was a leguminous diet, so high in fiber. Most of it was from legumes, and it's 96 grams of fiber a day. So again, super duper high. Protein was pretty high in both of these groups. And even if we look at the regular diet, that was still 18 grams of fiber. That's more than most people get on average. The high legume diet was also pretty low in fat, but also 60% of calories from carb. So high carbohydrate, but super duper high in fiber. And a ton of that fiber came from legumes. And again, this is a pretty good result. So the fasting glucose, so the basal glucose, went down very clearly. That was 1 millimole per litre, a very clear result. And again, you can see a bigger signal on the fasting. 2-hour glucose, it looked like it came down, but again, if you look at the graphs, it wasn't entirely consistent. And actually, the authors themselves state, having seen all of these results, is high fiber, based on all of their studies, seems to significantly work on, in particular, fasting glucose homeostasis. And actually, if you look at all of these studies, the effect on postprandial glucose actually seems to be a bit questionable. And I think that's important when we're thinking about glucose control in our patients and what we work on. But nevertheless, all of this shows you, I think, fiber is incredibly powerful without weight loss at influencing glucose homeostasis. It definitely lowers glucose. But I think you can also see these are really, really high in fiber. And that is so important clinically to know when we're thinking about how we inform our patients of what diets can do. Probably increasing by 10, 20 grams of fiber a day is not realistically going to do much. But if people are able to get up to the 60, 70, 80 grams a day, then it looks like they will have probably very, very good fasting insulin sensitivity, and possibly postprandial as well. So my conclusion is, can high-carb plant-based diets improve glucose independent of weight loss? At really high quantities of fiber, I definitely think they can. And like I said, I think there is some caution with these studies because I'm not entirely sure they were type 2. Many of them, by the way, were very lean, which is curious when we think about type 2. But like I said, remission, like normalization of glucose, even at these really high levels of fiber and really, really high in plants, probably not. So let's now move on to mechanisms of action. So what's the evidence in terms of plant-based diets and how do we think they're working? Well, the first way, almost certainly, is the fat content, that it overwhelmingly comes from unsaturated fats, and I'll present the evidence for that. They are nearly always very high in fiber. Some, if you are having a predominantly plant-based diet, getting above 60 grams a day is pretty easy, and we'll come to some tips of how to do that. And I'm just going to touch on the polyphenol and phytonutrients because I think that's emerging evidence and important to discuss. So there is really strong evidence that having a high unsaturated fat diet compared to a low saturated fat diet improves insulin sensitivity. For example, we know that if you have a lot of linolenic acid, so N6 fatty acids, that is going to change the phospholipid bilayer, for example, of the myocytes, so the muscle cells in your skeletal muscle. That is strongly associated with having very insulin sensitive muscles. So if you are consuming a lot of N6 fatty acids, these individuals seem to have really improved peripheral insulin sensitivity, which is really important because that's going to help keep glucose getting sucked out of the blood. But I again should emphasize it's a very, very small effect that probably takes place over time. Because even though having this high unsaturated to saturated fat ratio definitely improves insulin sensitivity, it doesn't actually change in the studies that we have glucose to any meaningful degree. So it's protecting us, it's improving the pathophysiology, but it isn't almost certainly going to improve glucose in the short term. Likewise, there's also evidence for liver insulin sensitivity. That's important because that will control your fasting glucose. And again, if we look at studies where they are comparing saturated versus unsaturated fatty acids, you see improved hepatic insulin sensitivity. So again, plant-based diets, which are high in unsaturated fats, almost certainly are really improving underlying insulin sensitivity, which is fantastic. Fiber does a bunch of things. And I have to emphasize for the 50th time, this is at high levels of fiber that we see these things. So fermentable fibers, so they're the kind that go to the gut and are fermented by the microbiome. There's evidence that they improve hepatic insulin sensitivity, so they can reduce the amount of glucose coming out of the liver. They improve adipocyte, so that's on the left-hand side, so fat insulin sensitivity. That's important because one of the roles of insulin is to suppress lipolysis from the adipose tissue. If your fat is leaking out fatty acids into the bloodstream, that makes you insulin resistant. So the fact that fiber is making your adipose tissue insulin sensitive is again a good thing. There's evidence that it improves muscle insulin sensitivity. On the middle, we have gastric emptying, so it lowers glucose absorption and the rate of absorption from the gut. And it also seems to, at high levels, improve the first phase insulin response. So this is the ability of the pancreas to produce a lot of insulin during meal times. So fiber at very high amounts, which is important to note, but it addresses pretty much every pathophysiological defect that there is when we consider development of type 2 diabetes. And this is probably why consistently in observational studies, we see a protective effect of high fiber diets. And at high enough amounts, you do always see, even if it's not a massive effect, you see a signal on insulin sensitivity and glucose in general. So what about polyphenols and phytonutrients? It's really important to note most of the data on this is circumstantial. So I mentioned PrediMed. I mean, I don't think fat or the monounsaturated fat component of that diet was influencing much. I think it was probably due to the phytonutrients, but it's a bit circumstantial. A lot of the evidence is preclinical. So this is in vitro, where you might take liver cells or muscle cells and have a look at the effect of phytonutrient on insulin signaling, for example. There have been some studies in humans, but they are all testing extracts, so far as I know. And they look at extracts which are very, very concentrated phytonutrients. And it looks interesting. It looks like they can slow glucose absorption from the gut. It also looks like They might act on the SGLT2 receptor, so absorbing glucose across the intestinal membrane. So it's an exciting area. Again, I think the effect of these things is probably very small, but I think you combine everything together that yes, the effect of the fatty acid profile doesn't change glucose acutely, but it protects insulin sensitivity, plus the fiber, that it's affecting in small ways all of those different parts of glucose homeostasis, and probably the additional effect of phytonutrients. You add all of those things together in a dietary pattern, and it's protective against developing type 2 diabetes. So I know that this is a group that's particularly interested, I think, in plant predominant diets, but even people who do eat some meat, even flexitarians, everyone, even if they're on a low carb diet or a high carb diet, everyone will benefit from having a lot more plants in the diet. And this is what I do in my clinical practice. So I think we've got to think about weight control. So energy density is key here. So that's one of the things that you'll be incorporating practically in planning meals, adding in fiber wherever you can, and adding polyphenol type compounds, phytonutrients. These are the three things I think about when I'm planning meals or helping patients to plan meals. So you can kind of see over the next couple of slides, it's basically adding plants and adding salad and adding veggies and adding fruit wherever you can. So even if someone is having, I mean, I recommend typically oats for my patients, but if people are having things like Weetabix or bran flakes, so I recommend high fiber cereals. Raisins and sultanas are pretty cheap fruits to add in. Grated apple goes really well, even, for example, in overnight oats. Berries are great in cereal. Frozen is cheaper. And any nuts or seeds, I don't think there are any meaningful differences between any of them. So whatever the cheapest ones are, or whatever the ones people like, will significantly improve the nutritional quality of the breakfast and improve glucose control. Lunchtime, breakfast but toast. What about adding avocado mashed onto toast, mushing up peas? You can even get in supermarkets kind of a lemon flavored kind of mushed up pea mash that can go on toast. Again, that's going to add polyphenols, fiber, veggies. Even thinking about having some cooked veggies on the side. So things like asparagus, grilled tomatoes, for example, with toast. Even with a cooked breakfast, don't forget good old baked beans are a legume. If people like, choose the low sugar version. But you can have an absolute ton of veggies. Even if you have someone who really is a typical carnivore, you can add half a plate of veggies very easily in a cooked breakfast, whether it's mushrooms, asparagus, tomatoes, onions, spinach. If someone's having an omelette, you can make half of that omelette, whether it's plant-based eggs or regular eggs, you can make half of it come from these whole plant foods. And lunch and dinner, this is the typical kind of plate I give every single patient, pretty much regardless of what they're doing, except for athletes who probably need a bit more calories. Everyone else would benefit from eating a bit more like this. So half a plate should always be some form of veggie. So if someone's having spaghetti bolognese, for example, I might get them to reduce some of the meat or the plant-based meat, whatever they have, maybe reduce some of the pasta and make up half the plate with vegetables. So whether it's courgettes, mushrooms, peppers go well. Tomato, even in the sauce, counts as one of your one a day. It is going to have beneficial compounds in it. Curries are obviously super easy to make, really high in plants. Cauliflower and broccoli go really well. Stir fries are fantastic because you can cook them up so quickly. They're also good if people are on a lower income. So for example, at Sainsbury's at the end of the day, very often those big ready packs of stir-fried vegetables are down to like 70p. So they might have bean sprouts, carrots in them, a bunch of different sliced up vegetables ready to go. You can cook them in 4 to 5 minutes, cook up some noodles in about 3 minutes. And for plant-based people, have some tofu. Others, you could just add some more legumes. So for example, if you're making like a ginger or quite a sweet stir fry, things like black beans go really well. So you can throw legumes in there as well. And even if you have someone who likes a typical Sunday roast, you can make sure half the plate is, and I don't include potatoes, by the way, in these veggies, parsnips, leeks, carrots, even things like squash, even things like roasted onion go really well. So whatever a person is eating, you can always make half the plate veggies. And I'm probably preaching to the wrong crowd here. I'm sure everyone gets this, but embracing legumes is really, really key. So legumes can go in absolutely everything. This is something I talk to patients about and provide meal plans and recipes, because I think most people, if they tried them and if they have them, they really like them. But it's one of those things we don't typically eat in England or in British cuisine, and I think people just forget they exist. But if you give people ideas about how to incorporate legumes in all lunches and all dinners, if people so choose, it's amazing how versatile they are. So you can throw in cannellini beans into a salad. You could have obviously lentils in curry. In pasta, butter beans go really well, like with a tomato sauce and oregano. In poke bowls, edamame is a nice addition. In stir fries, I like adding black beans into lots of my stir fries. So again, this is a way to reduce the meat or the plant-based meat, whatever component of the meal, reduce the carbohydrate if they so choose, and you are adding in a bunch of fiber, a bunch of phytonutrients, and almost certainly lowering, particularly if you replace meat, the energy density of meals when you do this. And it's also worth thinking outside the box. So typically we think about the way of planning meals where it's like protein, carb, and veggies. But even now we have some really, really good legume-based pastas. And there's some that would have per serving about 30 grams of protein and about 30 grams of fiber, or close to that. So when you have those meals, you don't even need meat or plant-based meat. Like, that's giving you more than enough protein for the meal. So you could then have like a black bean linguine, for example, and then just make it with a bunch of veggies and add some rapeseed oil on there. And it's a low energy dense, high protein, high fiber, low glycemic, very filling, very healthy meal. And you can have 3 servings of plants easily within one plate. So this, again, is something I introduce to lots of my patients. So to summarize, and hopefully I've left lots of time for questions, plant-based or predominant diets can definitely help glycemic control. Now, I think primarily they work, and we can talk about this, I think they mostly work by lowering the energy density of the diet and helping people manage their weight or lose weight. But I do think there is a combination of effects. So the fiber, the phytonutrients, the fat components, which together do have a profound effect on the underlying pathophysiology and the underlying health of the body. And I think a clinical aim for anyone should be, at a minimum, adding 1 to 2 servings of plants into every meal. And of course, don't forget legumes. So with that, I will end.
Thank you so much, Nicola. Let me just stop share. So we already have lots of questions in, and anyone who has got questions, please do ask them. That was packed full of information. So I'm just going to get going with the questions. So we had a couple of questions about a ketogenic diet, no surprises there, but would love to know your thoughts about a plant-based ketogenic diet, sort of eco-Atkins style, but maybe high in unsaturated fatty acids. And the question is specifically, can that help with resting the pancreas, especially because fiber can be high in this type of a ketogenic diet?
Yes, I actually think for type 2 diabetes, a plant-based keto diet is probably physiologically the best diet there is for type 2 diabetes for several reasons. Firstly, if you get into ketosis, ketones themselves seem to lower glucose, independent of weight loss. Number 2, you've got all of the things about plants we just talked about. So you are fixing everything underneath. 3, believe it or not, ketogenic diets, even plant-based ones, tend to be higher in protein. And I didn't talk about protein today, but if anyone's ever followed me, I'm quite bullish on protein because it helps promote the insulin response after a meal. So you are almost certainly, with a plant-based ketogenic diet, massively lowering glucose. So you stop glucose from being toxic, and you are also fixing the underlying physiology. So yes, I think plant-based keto diets are fantastic.
Wonderful. And also, you did touch on that when you mentioned kind of the Indian diet, but there is an increasing prevalence, it seems, of type 2 diabetes in sort of leaner, younger South Asians. I'm South Asian myself. Do you think that that might be especially suitable for those younger kind of patients with type 2 diabetes, or do you not think that that's that relevant there?
No, I do actually. I mean, there's not much evidence out there. I mean, number one, we are just beginning to. So Shivani Misa is an amazing diabetes researcher, specifically looking at type 2 diabetes in the young, and looking very often in South Asian populations because they too tend to develop it early. But based on everything we know about that, yes, I mean, I think the powerful thing about high protein and high fiber is that they are effective without weight loss. So if you have a lean person, you don't want them to become skeletal. That's not really an option you have. So indirect, like people lost 10 kilograms to get remission, but you don't have that option if someone has a BMI of 21 already or 20. So yes, absolutely. In those individuals, I think keeping glucose well controlled will not only work in the short term, I think it's very likely it will be protective over the long term, because the glucose isn't going to be damaging the pancreas, the cells, the tissues over like a 40-year lifetime.
Wonderful, thanks. And side note, but Dr. Misra actually diagnosed me with monogenic diabetes. I've been misdiagnosed for years and years.
Isn't
So
she a superstar? She's a
yeah,
superstar.
yeah, she really is. So one of these questions is from a dietitian. I noticed that you only had meat on the plate for main meals. Do you discuss plant-based protein sources with your omnivorous patients, such as tofu, tempeh, seitan? Do you discuss those, or do you save those for your plant-based only clients?
It depends. If I yes, I like to. I mean, my typical diet sheets give people options, and I think one of the advantages of many plant-based meats is they're low in saturated fat, and lots of them are lower energy dense. So if I feel it's appropriate, I do. I mean, something like tofu is great because the protein per calorie is fabulous. So if someone's thinking about a low energy dense diet, it's a great food. So I do tend to, if I have someone who I feel is very powerful, how do I put this? Powerfully carnivore, like they really want to eat a carnivore diet, and they say things like, I love meat, I might not push it then, but I think most people are receptive. And I would actually say often what I end up doing is correcting misunderstandings. So there's a big thing about ultra processed foods. And so people go, oh, well, I thought those veggie sausages and stuff was ultra processed. And yes, it is, but I think it's a healthy ultra processed food. So the short answer is yes, I do. I think some of the plant-based foods out there are great.
Wonderful, thank you. So this is a question about energy density. Can you elaborate a little on what you mean by a low energy density diet? I presume you're referring to low calorie, low fat specific from packaged and processed foods. It can be really confusing for patients when trying to advise them to follow a low fat, low calorie diet, but then explain that foods such as nuts, oats and avocados, as you had on your slides, which are usually labeled as being high in fat and calories, are actually healthy.
Oh, that's a really good point. Yes, thank you for the opportunity to clarify. So the reason I had avocados and nuts on there wasn't about the energy density. It was about the phytonutrients. So thinking about foods that you can add in that look like, we almost certainly think are going to help prevent it. But in terms of energy density, it's basically defined by the number of calories per gram. Some people do calories per mil, but it's basically being able to eat a lot without consuming lots of calories. And I'm explaining it that way to kind of an academic audience. But the way I wouldn't mention energy density to patients. I would just say, make sure half your plate is peppers, broccoli, cauliflower, etc. Because by doing that, it's going to be a much lower energy dense meal.
Okay, that's super helpful. Yeah, the plate method is really helpful in these cases. I'm curious about the role of products such as Huel or other plant-based protein shakes, even if they're quite processed, being a useful sort of meal replacement for calorie control and to help with weight loss. What are your thoughts on this?
I don't think, I mean, I'm not drawing on any evidence because I don't think anyone studied it. I don't think Huel would be helpful as a weight loss tool because it actually is quite high calorie. And I don't think it's filling. So, for example, there is some evidence that liquid calories are not as filling as solid. So even though you are drinking, so they're 400 calories and 20 grams of protein. I mean, I sometimes, if I'm really busy, I will have a Huel just because I'm busy. And sometimes I have it after I've been weight training for the calories. So I'm drinking it on my train home because I'm like, boom, I need 400 calories and I still want to eat again in an hour. So I don't think they would be useful for a weight loss tool, but I do think they are a great product if people need something quick on occasion, or even as a protein shake after the gym.
Thank you. That's really helps to clarify it. This is a quite specific question. Longevity studies appear to show a protein intake close to the RDA, 9 to 11%, significantly reduce the incidence of diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and can lead to weight loss independent of calorie intake. Have you seen any recent studies that support this?
So was that high protein or low protein? Can you say that again?
Lower protein, sort of close to the RDA of 9 to 11% of total calorie intake. They're basically saying that some longevity studies, I think they're referencing sort of Volta Longo and those sorts of longevity studies.
So I don't know anything about cancer at all. I know there are different kinds of cancer which have different pathophysiology, so I can't comment on cancer or longevity. In terms of type 2 diabetes, that's my expertise. So far as I know, the evidence that protein per se, the evidence that too much protein causes type 2 diabetes, I don't think is there. What the evidence does seem to suggest is too much animal protein. Too much, like you can have a bit, but too much seems to be causing type 2. And so how I reconcile that is it's not about the protein, it's not about the amino acids, it's probably about the iron, specifically in red meat. So what we see in some mechanistic studies is that too much iron impairs beta cell function. So my interpretation of the literature is too much amino acids, so too much protein per se is not a risk factor, but I think too much animal protein, which gives you too much iron, is.
Oh, that's fascinating. Thank you. Sorry, I'm going really fast with the questions because everyone is really good ones. And we see many reports on increases in type 2 diabetes. Do you think that's 100% attributable to overall weight gain and obviously the fact that most people are carrying excess weight here? Or do you envisage, for instance, eating ultra-processed food causing the onset of type 2 diabetes also in lean people?
Oh, so I missed the start. So was that a question about ultra-processed food?
Yeah, why there's an increase in type 2 diabetes? Do you think it's because of weight gain, or do you think that we're also going to see more type 2 diabetes incidence in leaner people who are just eating a lot of ultra-processed food?
Ooh, great question. So if we look globally, 2/3 of the rise in type 2 diabetes prevalence can be attributed to weight gain. Now, of course, weight is a proxy for adipose tissue. So I know people complain about BMI. It's useful at a population level because the majority of people with a high BMI, it's not muscle, it's adipose tissue. So that's 2/3, it's weight gain. A third is aging. So the fact that we've got an aging population. In terms of lean type 2 diabetes, I think it is possible that really fiber deficient diets could, in susceptible people, increase the risk of type 2. I don't think it's good. I mean, compared to weight, it's not doing much, but it's not going to help. It is possible. I mean, there's lots of interest in additives and, emulsifiers and all of that. It is true that in terms of those aspects of ultra-processed foods, we have historically focused on toxicity. So does it cause cancer or not? We haven't looked closely at metabolism. And it is possible that there are some novel ingredients in foods that are adversely affecting the beta cell, which could downstream cause problems. So I don't rule it out. I mean, I think the impact, the magnitude of effect compared to weight gain is nothing, but could it be a primary driver of hyperinsulin secretion? Yes, could be, and we should look at that.
Thank you. And this is the question I think everyone has been most excited for, but we would love your thoughts on CGM usage in people who are firstly don't currently have diabetes, people who have pre-diabetes, people who have PCOS, so all of those sorts of areas. We just love your thoughts on that, and also on Zoe, of course, which you have tackled on your social media. And
Okay, Okay, let's start with CGM. CGM in people without diabetes. I think that in terms of what a CGM is going to tell you about your health or metabolism, if you don't have pre-diabetes or diabetes, is close to nil. It's not going to tell you about inflammation, so far as we know. It's not going to tell you about your risk of type 2 diabetes any more than compared to an A1C or an OGTT. It's not telling you about your metabolism. This is absurd. Blood pressure, in terms of your metabolism and your health, fasting insulin, fasting and postprandial triglycerides, all of that is going to tell you more. Your resting heart rate is going to tell you more about your health. Muscle mass is going to tell you more about your health. Blood pressure and cholesterol, like those things tell you about your metabolic health. Glucose is useless if you don't have type 2 diabetes. But do I accept and acknowledge that maybe in some people a CGM might be a useful behavioral tool? In other words, that you kind of got a dietary plan and it's pretty healthy, so it's having more legumes rather than refined carbohydrate, and that maybe a CGM, if you're using it, is going to nudge you and be like, oh yeah, that's a reminder because I had a nice low glucose curve and it's because I'm having loads of legumes, you know, like a kind of reward. I can accept that maybe it might be a useful behavioral tool. So that's NGT. In pre-diabetes, there's some evidence that your glucose might get high enough to be independently associated with type 2, but it's far more likely that the reason you are at higher risk of cardiovascular disease is because your insulin resistance has got that bad. You've got fat in the liver, your pancreas isn't working because you've got too much inflammation and fat. Most of that is going to be driven by weight gain. So your glucose is only a symptom of the stuff that's gone wrong. So a CGM isn't going to tell you what to do. It might be a reminder of, oh my God, look how high my glucose is getting. But you could, for example, have 5 sausages and your glucose would be flat. But as I've described, you are not fixing the underlying pathophysiology. So my opinion, even in pre-diabetes, your CGM is a tool for behavior change. And then in diabetes, it can be very useful, gives not without anxiety, that should be really clear. Even in diabetes, it's not perfect, but glucose gets to a level where the glucose causes damage. And so if you can have something that's recording, you know, measuring that, that's very useful for people to manage their condition.
Okay, that's really helpful. And then Zoe, obviously you've tackled this on social media, and everyone, please do follow Dr. Guess on Instagram because you've got some great content there. But would you be able to kind of talk a bit about that to our healthcare audience, because it's something that still crops up a lot from our members as well?
Let me start with the positive. I think Zoe has great recipes. So on their Instagram page, I mean, talking about legumes, how do we make legumes delicious? I think Zoe has some fabulous recipes. As a program, all it does, I think, the evidence suggests, is it encourages everyone to have a high plant-based, minimally processed diet. Great. That's a good thing. But my problem with Zoe is they are not honest at all about what it is. Their USP is that we have individual biology, you know, individual responses to foods based on our unique biology, and we need a program based on that. There is zero evidence for that, and I think Zoe know it too, which is why their recent trial was basically a marketing tool, and they did not even attempt to test whether biological personalization is a thing. So it is an extraordinarily expensive way to eat a plant-based diet.
Yeah, do you think that kind of personalization or personalized nutrition could become a thing? Do you think that we're quite far away from that potential? Is it not something that we really even need to worry about at all?
Great question. Depends on what you're personalizing on. So if you're personalizing on tastes and preferences, this is where I think apps and technology is great, because if you know what someone's eating and you know what their goal is, you can say, well, you're having, I mean, let's say beef 5 days a week. If you were personalizing on that, you could say, well, twice a week, why not have fish? Another twice a week, why not try legumes? So it's personalized based on what someone's eating. Tech can do that, and there's evidence that is effective at helping people change behaviors. Then you come down to what I would call phenotype personalization. So you are personalizing based on observable, accepted risk factors. So if someone's got high cholesterol, If they've got normal glucose but high cholesterol, well, you personalize based on that. You don't need to give them advice about glucose control. You just say, well, you're having tons of saturated fat, here's what you could have instead. Have more soluble fiber, etc. Evidence for that. But then you come to this big data, novel personalization, gut microbiome, blood type, whatever it is. There's zero evidence for that. And actually, the one good trial that is kind of done personalizing based on a bunch of very sexy science found zero difference in weight or visceral fat compared to a healthy diet. So I think this unique microbiome, metabolomic, sexy sounding, sciencey personalization, zero evidence.
Okay, fantastic. And what are your thoughts on intermittent fasting and specifically kind of time restricted eating? There's been a bit more kind of conversations and research that's around circadian rhythm eating within the kind of broader umbrella of intermittent fasting. What are your views on that and its role for both prevention or management of type 2 diabetes? It's quite a big question, sorry.
I mean, in general, I think the primary usefulness for time restricted feeding, etc., is the fact that it just stops you from eating so much. I think it's useful as a behavioral tool to have a healthy dietary pattern. The only weight neutral effect I've ever seen or benefit of time restricted feeding is the really early one, where people are like starting eating at 8 and finish, or 6 and finish by 2. I've never met a human being that wants to eat that way. I mean, it would just, you would have no social life forever. So if you can do that, great. But otherwise, I don't think the evidence is that great. There is some evidence that eating at certain times, so for example, not having too much particularly refined carbohydrate at night, might affect things like blood pressure. All of these things are pretty small if they do something.
Okay. Good to know. And this was a quick question about cooling potatoes, and obviously you can do the same with pasta and rice to increase resistant starch and prevent a glucose spike. What are your views on this?
First of all, I loved how you did this with glucose. It does work. So if you look at the studies, it is reducing glucose excursions. I think that you get more bang for your buck, and it's a more delicious and easy way of things, just bunging a bunch of plants on your plate rather than faffing around with freezing and cooling. Like if you have a nice cold pasta, like I might make a pasta salad, cook it the night before, eat it for my lunch, and it's cold and great, but it's not something, just because I think it's a bit of a faff, that I would recommend people do to control their glucose.
Perfect. Yeah, just if you're eating leftovers, it's fine, but nothing you've got to stress about. And then I've got one final question. So you're doing some really interesting work around gestation. I'm just running a poll just for everyone who's here. But you've done some really interesting work around, or you're doing some interesting work around gestational diabetes. Is there anything specific that might be relevant for people listening, or anything that you've kind of found out through your work when it comes to gestational diabetes? And I know there's not much research on plant-based diets and gestational diabetes, for example, but are there any thoughts that you have or anything you'd want to share on that?
So I mean, I've worked on some studies on gestational diabetes. At Oxford, Neris Asbury is our genius on gestational diabetes. In general, my observation of the research is it's an incredibly difficult time to change your diet in a meaningful way. So for example, people have looked at moderate weight reduction. People have been scared to before, because the story has always been eat for 2, and people are like, oh my God, you can't lose weight in pregnancy. That actually seems to have some benefit. When it comes to plant-based diets, I think the really challenging thing is, and I've never been pregnant, but if anyone on the panel has been, it's not, sometimes you're just trying to keep food down. You don't necessarily feel that great. And again, changing anything can be challenging. Maybe it's worth touching on low carbohydrate diets and actually dispelling some myths. For example, lots of people think because elevated glucose during pregnancy is associated with negative maternal outcomes, but also in the offspring. And people have kind of suggested, well, have a low carb diet because you're going to lower glucose. But the thing about low carb diets is you are also raising triglycerides and you're raising fatty acids, or non-esterified fatty acids. And non-esterified fatty acids might have the same negative effect on the fetus and fetal growth as does glucose. So just to emphasize, if you're just fixing glucose, it doesn't mean you're fixing the problem, because you might be fixing glucose and causing elevated non-esterified fatty acids.
Oh, that's super interesting. Thank you for sharing that. Where can everyone keep up to date with all your work, Nicola, and kind of what do you have planned next? Like, what are you working on at the moment, and what should we keep our eyes peeled for?
I mean, at Oxford, we do really awesome research developing programs for type 2 diabetes remission, weight management, and it's about like, if there are primary care practitioners on, it's about developing things that can be delivered by primary care practitioners. One thing that might be of interest is we are interested that the thing that's great for patients is choice. So right now they've got path to remission, that's meal replacement. We are working on developing effective low carbohydrate interventions, but it strikes me as crazy that we don't have a good plant-based intervention. And I don't know of anyone that's developing one. And I think that could be another option. There's no right diet for everyone, but I would like to work on or work with people on developing a plant-based intervention for prevention of type 2 or particularly remission of type 2. So that's what we're doing. And find me on Instagram, where I'm trying to post more videos on dispelling myths about Zoe, personalized nutrition and glucose.
Thank you. Yeah, I think one thing we didn't mention here is that obviously a Freestyle Libre or CGM, whichever one you go for, is about £50 for just 2 weeks of wear. It's ludicrously expensive. Obviously, if you're trying to use it for preventative health, it's not going to be available to you on the NHS. I think still a lot of people with type 2 diabetes find it hard to access on the NHS sometimes as well. So can really, really add up. I think for a year's worth of use, it's almost £4,000. So
Yeah.
that is astronomical for a lot of people to actually be able to afford.
Yeah, I agree.
So, okay, wonderful. So I think we'll wrap up there, but thank you so much, Nicola, and thank you everyone for joining. I hope it was really useful to all of you, and I think we just about managed to get through most of the questions. So it was a whistle stop sort of Q&A session, but yeah, thanks everyone and have a good evening.
Thanks everyone.